Today we dive into true scary taxi driver horror stories. In this video, we have 3 chilling tales that will send shivers down your spine. Story 1. Passenger who knew too much. A mysterious passenger knows every dark secret about the driver. Story 2. Fare from Hell. A ride to an abandoned location where strange phenomena begin to unfold. Story 3. Vanishing passenger. A woman disappears before a graveyard, leaving behind a terrifying truth. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our upcoming videos. Story 1. The passenger who knew too much. I'll never forget the night I picked up that passenger. It was around 11 p.m., the end of my shift. I was dead tired, but I saw this guy standing by the side of the road waving me down. He looked normal enough. Dark coat, a bit scruffy, probably in his mid-40s. So I pulled over. The moment he got in, though, something felt off. He gave me his address, and as I started driving, he casually says, "You got 2 kids, right? A boy and a girl." I froze for a second. Sure, it's a safe guess, but still. It was weird. I chuckled it off and said, "Yeah, how'd you know that?" He smiled, looking out the window. "I know a lot about you, Mike." My stomach dropped. I hadn't told him my name. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he'd seen my ID badge or something, but then he starts talking about my wife, Jenny. Describes her perfectly, down to the fact that she's been wearing her hair shorter lately because of work. He even knew we'd had an argument the night before. I hadn't told anyone about that. "Okay, who are you, man?" I asked, trying to keep my cool. He just kept smiling. "You really need to cut down on those late-night snacks, Mike. That cholesterol isn't getting any better, and you wouldn't want to end up like your dad, right?" Now I was full-on freaked out. My dad had died of a heart attack a few years ago, something I didn't talk about much, especially not with strangers. My hands gripped the wheel tighter, and I started thinking about just dropping him off early, anywhere. That's when he starts getting specific. He told me Jenny was going to call me in the morning, worried because she'd found a lump on her breast. My chest tightened. He said it wasn't going to be anything serious, but I'd spend the next week freaking out about it. Then he leaned forward, close to my ear, and whispered, "In 2 minutes, a red sedan will blow through the next intersection. Don't stop, or you'll never make it home." My heart was pounding. We were coming up to the intersection, and sure enough, there it was. A red sedan barreling down the road, not even slowing down at the light. If I hadn't hesitated, I would have been in its path. I slammed on the brakes, watching as it sped by, inches away from me. I turned to the back seat, my voice shaking. How do you know this?" But the seat was empty. No one was there. I pulled over, heart racing, trying to catch my breath. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Jenny. "We need to talk in the morning. Found something. Don't worry." Story 2. Fare from Hell. It started like any other late-night shift, but by the end, I was ready to quit driving for good. Around 1 a.m., I pulled up to this guy standing alone outside a bar. He was tall, wearing a long dark coat, and had this blank expression like he'd been waiting for me. He slid into the back seat without a word, and when I asked where he was headed, he simply said, "Take me to Harper's Hollow." I'd heard of the place, an old abandoned neighborhood about an hour outside the city. Nobody lived there anymore, not since that fire in the 80s. "You sure, man? There's nothing out there?" I asked, but he didn't respond, just stared straight ahead, his face completely expressionless. I sighed, chalked it up to a weird night, and started driving. About 20 minutes in, things started to get strange. The temperature in the car dropped so fast that my breath turned to mist. It was the middle of summer, and my heater was broken, so I knew it couldn't be anything normal. Then my radio started flickering, static 1 second, then bursts of old, crackling music the next, like something from a century ago. Every time I looked back at him in the rearview mirror, he was just sitting there, staring out the window, unfazed by all of it. Then, the shadows. I swear the shadows on the side of the road began moving, stretching out like long arms trying to grab the car. I blinked hard, convinced it was just my tired mind playing tricks, but they kept getting closer, the trees along the road warping in the headlights, bending at impossible angles. I glanced at my GPS, hoping to reassure myself, but it wasn't working either, just spinning, showing us in the middle of nowhere. That's when the lights in the cab flickered and the engine started sputtering, like it was struggling to keep going. "You need to turn back, man." "Something's wrong," I finally said, my voice barely steady. But the guy didn't say a word. He just lifted his hand and pointed straight ahead, as if telling me to keep going. By the time we reached Harper's Hollow, the car barely made it up the dirt road. The whole place looked like a ghost town. Burnt-out houses, rusted street signs, and not a single light in sight. As I pulled to a stop, the man opened the door and stepped out without a word. He walked off into the darkness, disappearing between the trees. I didn't wait long. As soon as he was gone, I shifted into reverse, ready to get the hell out of there. But something caught my eye in the back seat. His driver's license. I picked it up, hands shaking. The photo was him, all right, but the license was dated 1973. It was impossible. The guy in the picture looked exactly like the man I had just dropped off, but he hadn't aged a day. I didn't bother looking back. I floored it out of there and haven't been back since. Every now and then, though, I check my rear view, half expecting to see him sitting in my back seat again, waiting for another ride to nowhere. Story 3. Vanishing Passenger. It was one of those long, quiet nights where the city felt dead. I was just driving around, waiting for a fare, when I saw her standing on the corner, waving me down. She was young, maybe in her 20s, with long dark hair and wearing a pale blue dress. She looked cold, shivering under a thin jacket, so I pulled over and let her in. "Where to?" I asked, expecting the usual late-night bar run or maybe a trip home from a bad date. "The cemetery," she said softly, staring out the window. I raised an eyebrow. "You sure? It's pretty late for a visit." She didn't respond, just nodded, so I shrugged and started driving. The whole time, she barely said a word. I tried making small talk, asking if she was meeting someone or needed help, but all she did was quietly watch the streets pass by. Something about her seemed off. Not in a dangerous way, but like she was lost, or maybe even sad. About 15 minutes in, things started to get weird. My rearview mirror fogged up, and I noticed the temperature in the car dropping fast. The heater was cranked up, but it felt like someone had left a window open. I glanced back at her, and she was still just sitting there, hands folded in her lap, looking out the window. When we pulled up near the cemetery gates, I turned around to tell her we'd arrived, but the back seat was empty. My heart stopped. I hadn't heard the door open, hadn't felt the car shift, nothing. She was just gone. I jumped out of the car, checked the street, looked around, but there was no sign of her. No footprints, no sounds, no fading figure in the distance. It was like she'd vanished into thin air. Shaken, I got back in the car and sat there for a few minutes, trying to make sense of it. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was I that tired? But as I was about to drive away, I noticed something. On the seat where she had been sitting was a small pendant, a silver cross on a thin chain, like something someone might have worn for years. I hadn't noticed it before, and there was no way it had just fallen out of nowhere. The next day, I told one of the guys at the cab station about what happened. He just stared at me, pale as a ghost, before asking, "What did she look like?" I described her. Young, long dark hair, blue dress. His face went white. "You're not the first driver to pick her up," he said. "She died in a car crash right near that cemetery. It was years ago." I couldn't believe it. "That's not possible," I muttered, but he nodded grimly. "People say she still tries to get home, but never quite makes it. I've been back down that street a few times since, but every time I pass the cemetery, I get this cold chill in the air, like she's still there, waiting for her next ride." Thank you all for listening to my stories. If you enjoyed them, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future videos.